Dr. Karmapinso, but I assure you that he will have a lot to say. I just want to, introduce Dr. Karmapinso very briefly. So, Karmapinsola teaches Buddhism and Bhutan studies in Bhutan and abroad. He finished his full monastic training before he joined Balliol College, Oxford, where he received a doctorate in Oriental Studies. He then worked as a researcher at Cambridge University, CNRS, Paris, and the University of Virginia. And he is a thought leader and a social worker in Bhutan, and also one of its most decorated and admired scholars. He has spoken extensively on Bhutan's history, religion, culture, and development, and among authoring over 100 books and articles, he has authored The History of Bhutan, which is a monumental work of history, of Bhutanese history, and will be an extremely influential and enduring work for decades to come. So I am honored to interview you basically today about Buddhism traveling from the east to the west, and basically the modern context of Buddhism today. So let me start actually by asking you how you personally came to Buddhism.
Thank you, Tenzela, and namaste everyone. Since we are in the homeland of Buddhism, I thought it would be very appropriate for us to do something that the Buddha has recommended. I often start my sessions on Buddhist education trying out a very brief practice of mindfulness, and I think this is very important also for the later discussion. The Buddha, without necessarily having to follow a religion, the Buddha as a scientist has declared we are made up of two things, the mind and the body. We are here in our physical form, our body is here. Is your mind also here? Yes, wonderful. Can you feel the chair? Can you feel the clothes touching on your neck? Can you feel your presence here? So it's very important that we are here as a whole. So can we spend 15 seconds? I won't take too much of your time, but 15 seconds just to be here in the present moment. Feel the chair under you, feel your breath, feel your body. Let's be here both in body and mind. Thank you. So, Tenz's question was how I came to Buddhism. I come from Bhutan, and Bhutan is the next door neighbor to India, the origin of Buddhism. So, for us, we were born and brought up as Buddhists. Now, I particularly come from a family of religious priests. So ever since my childhood, I've been exposed to Buddhist practices and ideas, as most other Bhutanese are. And even today, the Bhutanese nationhood is heavily informed and inspired by this Buddhist heritage. And we feel strongly that this is one Indian heritage, Indian legacy that we have managed to keep up. Bhutan being now considered as the last surviving Buddhist country, officially Buddhist state in the world. So I would say it's really my birth in Bhutan, which I haven't planned myself. You could say some lamas claim that they plan their rebirths, but I would say mine was quite fortuitous that I was born in a Buddhist country like Bhutan and in a family that was deeply devout. So I would say it's mainly because of my family background that I became a Buddhist.
And can you tell us a little bit more specifically about your family background and your personal background? You became a monk as a boy and studied at, was it Sera Monastic University? And then afterwards you went on to then do academic studies at the famed Western institution of Oxford University. So can you tell us, how all of that happened?
Well, anyway, my own personal journey captures the topic for this session, traveling from east to the west, and that's exactly what I did, both in physical form and also intellectually. I, of course, being born and brought up in a very devout Buddhist family, always had that strong inclination to know more about the Buddha's teachings. And it was sometime in my teenage, when I was in class 9, just at the end of primary education, that I had this sudden yearning to become a monk. And the fourth king of Bhutan at the same time had this visionary goal of having school-trained monks in the monasteries. So it was in 1986 or so that I became a monk. And first I joined the Drukpa Kagyu monastery in Bhutan. That is the main Buddhist school in Bhutan. And then I left that school to go to India and spent a long time with the Tibetans. First in South India, in Karnataka, where there are these huge monasteries of 5,000 monks, 6,000 monks, several of them, where they give fantastic Buddhist education. And this, I think, is not known to many Indians, that in fact in India there are many great Buddhist learning centers established by the Tibetan refugees. So I was one of the beneficiaries, having spent about 10 years going through a very rigorous training, and then halfway through my training my masters also wanted me to go and run Buddhist monasteries. So I had both experience in getting education myself and also doing teaching as part of the training. And it was towards the end of my monastic training that I had this new yearning that I should also learn how to look at Buddhism as an academic discipline, as a science. Now, the way a devoted Buddhist practitioner would approach Buddhism is quite different from how an academic would approach. There are two different methodologies. So I was tempted to go and also learn the academic approach to Buddhism. So obviously the best place to go were in Western Europe or North America, and I was lucky to get a scholarship to Oxford. So that's where I spent doing my postgraduate training in classical Indian religions, and more specifically on Buddhism. There was one but small reason that again triggered me, that's related to the literary culture of Bhutan, I would say. Bhutan was going through modernization. School education that we have right now across the country was very new in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of the parents in those days would prefer to send a son or a daughter to a monastery or a nunnery. They would be much more pleased if the child took up a religious education. But by the time when I went to high school, say in the 80s, that trend has changed. People saw the school graduates and college graduates coming up and taking up important government jobs with a very good salary, fantastic security. So there was a shift in terms of educational objectives. Parents prefer to send the children to modern schools and colleges. And the new recruits coming from colleges and universities also had a slightly condescending approach to the traditional system, because the traditional system was seen as backward and superstitious and so forth. And I, as a monk, was on the receiving end of such discrimination. And I felt, well, I really need to go to a good Western university, as good as what they have, and then come back to talk to them and really show them that our own heritage is actually very rich, it's very advanced, it's very progressive. But before I could really come back from Europe with my degree, a major change happened in terms of the Bhutanese, the Himalayan perception of our heritage. And that was triggered by people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His Holiness the Dalai Lama's popularity in the West, particularly in America, increased in the 1990s. Especially after his Nobel Peace Prize, he became a much sought after leader. And he's a fantastic religious thinker and promoter of peace. So he got a great following, especially in the Hollywood and the American intelligentsia and literati. And these people would then look for a country where this Buddhist heritage is well preserved. And Bhutan was fortunately one place where the Tibetan Buddhist heritage was still intact. And they would come to Bhutan, and suddenly our modern educated bureaucrats and students would realize that there is something valuable in our own heritage that the West is now trying to obtain. So there was this very interesting change in the end of the 20th century in terms of our own approach and appreciation of the Buddhist heritage.
Can you talk a little bit more actually about Buddhism in India? Because of course Buddhism came from India, was exported to Tibet, to China, to East Asia, and then it's sort of, like you said, made the circle, right? And especially with the fall of Tibet, with the Dalai Lama and tens of thousands of Tibetan refugees coming into India. Now there are these settlements, monastic universities essentially, across South India, and they have really flourished. But I don't know how well known actually these centers are in India presently, and because you're right, they have had an enormous impact with the dissemination of Buddhism now to the West. And but this is where it all starts, right, in India. So could you talk more about that?
This is a very interesting phenomenon, really, that this is something His Holiness the Dalai Lama also often touches on, that the Tibetan Lamas are the chelas of India, the Guru. But then how well is the message of the Guru known in the Guru's land? I mean, there are lots of young people here in the audience. How familiar are you with the Buddha's teachings, Buddha's words? Not as a religion. I personally see Buddhism as a secular science. With the mindfulness we practice, it doesn't have to be a religious practice. It's just being aware of the moment. In many ways, most other Buddhist practices are also secular and humanistic in that respect. And I think what one could do a great deal more is in bringing out the Buddhist heritage, the old Indian Buddhist heritage, into contemporary India. I don't know, if, for instance, among the young people here, how many of you have heard of the person named Shanti Deva? Can you raise your hands if you have heard Shanti Deva? No one? Well, that will be very disappointing for me, because Shanti Deva, this Indian classical author, poet, philosopher, is the one person who has influenced my life, has changed my life course. He is, if I were to point out one author that still inspires me, that shapes my character, it's Shanti Deva. So if you haven't read Shanti Deva, I encourage you to read Shanti Deva. Leave the Buddhist sort of religious part of his work, just go for the moral and humanitarian teachings that he delivers. It's an extremely beautiful, influential work. There's a work called the Bodhicharya Avatara, engaging in the acts of the Bodhisattva. And I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with what a Bodhisattva, or who a Bodhisattva is, an altruistic being. In Tibet, interestingly, a lot of Tibetan Lamas would say, if you are seeking spiritual transformation to become a better person, because that's what Buddhism is about, of shaping your personality, your character into a better one, reducing the negative qualities like attachment and hatred and greed and pride and so forth, enhancing the virtuous qualities like compassion and intelligence and clarity and concentration and so forth. So in this process of transformation, people read, people listen to other people, people have to do meditation. There's so many different practices you do. In fact, the whole world of Buddhist theories and practices merge into this objective of transforming the mind from an ordinary state of the mind to a fully enlightened spirit of the Buddha. And some of the lamas I have studied with, they would say that if reading Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatar has not changed you in a bit, then there's no more hope. So the book is considered as powerful as that. It's a wonderful heritage that we have received from India. And it is one book that many monks, including myself when I was a monk, would have in memory, would be chanting it. Unfortunately, in the Tibetan translation, not in Sanskrit original. But I'm sure the Sanskrit original is even more beautiful. So this text is studied in all the monastic centers in India, in Bhutan, in Tibet. It's a very well-known text, but is that known really to the people of Shantideva himself? I think we need to do a lot more work to bring this kind of awareness. In India, fortunately, or unfortunately, Heather, it's really, depending on how you look at the Tibetan exodus in the 1950s and 60s. It was unfortunate that Tibet lost its territory and had to move out to India, and unfortunate that India gave asylum. But while Tibet went through a sad chapter of its history, the world has gained a lot through their loss. That the Dalai Lama wouldn't be as accessible to us if Tibet was not lost to the Chinese. That traditional Tibet had such a strict hierarchical system that most Tibetans would have had a glimpse of Dalai Lama from a long distance and wouldn't be even possible to approach him. So in a way, the unfortunate history of Tibet has really given the world this great richness of Buddhism, which came from India but via Tibet back to India. The West has also mostly received Tibetan Buddhist heritage via India, with a lot of the refugee lamas going from India to the West. There's still a great movement going on in that direction. I think there are some initial efforts being made now of also involving and engaging Indians. So in some monasteries in southern India, you'll find recruits from the local southern Indian communities as well.
Yeah, I really look forward to the day when Shantideva will be as well known to the average Indian college student as, you know, someone like Chetan Bhagat or Shakespeare. Yes.
I mean, all of you would have heard of Shakespeare. That's the test I do in Bhutan. Ask students raise their hands if they've heard of Shakespeare, and they'll all raise their hands. Shantideva, no one does.
When, yeah, he has just as rich body of work and as much to say about the human condition. So you've spoken about, yes, this the mainstream Buddhist philosophy in the West, perhaps, like mindfulness, right? That has really sort of taken the West by storm. Secular ethics, His Holiness is secular ethics, and this idea of the mindfulness as a way to live, but which has, right, say, it's very popular in the corporate offices of Wall Street, and, you know, the offices of San Francisco. It's what maybe now the average American knows most about Buddhism and finds most accessible. There are people who think that is a corruption. There are others who think it is a natural and maybe useful evolution. Where do you stand on the spectrum, I guess? Like, what is your approach to this?
Thank you, Tenzin, for this question. This is critical for understanding Buddhism. The term Buddhism is a late invention. Right? In the past, if you, for instance, ask Bhutanese who we are, most Bhutanese say we are Nangpa, and so will the Tibetans. And Nangpa literally means insiders. Why do you call yourself an insider? The main point is you focus more on the inner well-being, inner state of the mind, more than the external welfare. So it's not the house or the car or the land or the physical beauty or whatever that really counts in human well-being and happiness. It is really the state of the mind. If you have your mind in the right state, you achieve genuine happiness. That is the sort of main driving force, the main message of the Buddha, that you really need to fix the inner mind, your outlook, your principles, values, your approach. So the focus is entirely on the mind. It's a mind-centered religion. 2nd century Indian philosopher Aryadeva, I don't know again if you have heard of him, he is a student of Nagarjuna, and most of you would have heard of Nagarjuna, the great philosopher who propagated Shunyavada. He was a Shunyavada, the philosophy of emptiness. And Aryadeva says, the Buddhists, Brahmins, and the Jains teach the religion through their mind, through the ears, and their eyes. The Jains have much more visual consciousness, that they would be even sweeping the path they walk on to avoid killing insects. So visual consciousness. The Brahmin religion, that is to say Hinduism now, all the Brahmanical religions, Vedanta or Mimamsaka or Vaishashika or Sankhya, all of them are based on the Vedas that are transmitted orally. So it's more the auditory consciousness. But Aryadeva says he chose to follow the Buddha because the focus was more on the mind. That it was more the inner cognitive mind that mattered more in the Buddha's case. So there is that focus, and the current trend of having mindfulness in the West is a very simple practice of training the mind. In a traditional world like India or Bhutan or Tibet, you had a much more rigorous program of training the mind. Buddhism is seen as an art of mind training, a science of the mind. So there's a very rigorous, colorful, systematic approach to train the mind. In the West, Buddhism hasn't yet developed to that stage. It is on its way, but what they are much more interested in right now, when you're not really born and brought up as a Buddhist, you would want to try some simple things. And mindfulness is one very simple meditation technique that helps them relax. In a stressful world like New York or California or London, it's a fantastic sort of technique you pick up to relieve your stress. For body, a lot of people have taken up yoga. For the mind, people are taking mindfulness. It's really to sort of relax the mind and reach a very calm, clear, relaxed state where you are much more effective than when you are agitated and stressed out. So this has been happening, and mindfulness industry is now so big, as you mentioned. The question a lot of the traditional Buddhists ask about this modern, Western popularity of mindfulness is it really leading to sustained character building, so to say, to a sustained path to enlightenment? Because that is the ultimate objective of mindfulness in its original context. Mindfulness must help you transform your mind into a Buddha spirit, help you reach nirvana. But in the West, they are not necessarily seeking nirvana or enlightenment. They want to be better bankers, be able to negotiate much better with their adversaries or counterparts. They want to kill better if they're a soldier. So can we sanction such practice of mindfulness, which only makes them more worthy, more effective tools of human greed and power? I think the best answer given to this was by a very famous Zen practitioner and a psychologist who is promoting mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn. I heard him speak on YouTube saying, it is better to have a very attentive soldier shooting than to have a totally distracted, chaotic soldier shooting. So you can perform your duties better through mindfulness, even in killing people as a soldier, than without it. And I think it's true. But anyway, it would be important for the Western society also to go beyond the current therapeutic use of mindfulness, and at some point to see mindfulness as a technique to bring fundamental personal transformation.
So while we're on the subject of the development of Buddhism in the West, I think we must also talk about, really the recent scandals that have kind of rocked the Buddhist world in the West, and not just in the West, also the Buddhist world globally, with issues and instances of abuses by the guru and teacher, particularly sexual abuse. There's been recent scandals that have sort of exploded in the press and in the communities. Sogyal Rinpoche, Sakyong Mipham, these are names that come to my mind. So could you address that, please?
So when Buddhism was taken from India to Tibet, particularly in the second diffusion, Tibet received Buddhism from India in two chapters. First in the 7th, 8th and 9th century, and then there was the fall of the Tibetan imperial dynasty and a fracture of the whole empire. But Buddhism came back the second time, beginning the 10th century or so. And when there was this vast sort of, or rather uncoordinated effort being made to transmit Buddhism to Tibet, there are lots of charlatans as well going to Tibet. So you have this terminology of the gold-seeking pandits, the Indian pandits who were primarily there to get more gold from the Tibetans, and they were not the genuine masters from India. But of course, there were hundreds of others who were genuine masters, people like Atisha, very well celebrated in Tibet. So what you see is when you have a new idea or a new system of thoughts coming to a society, it takes time for the society to really build up a system to sort of strain and to sort out who is good, who is bad, what is right, what is wrong. And this is exactly the phase that the West is going through. Buddhism has started to come to the West since 100 years ago or so. It's now reaching almost the peak of adopting or translating Buddhism. There will be more efforts being done in the future, but the early phases are almost now over. But what we haven't yet got in the Western society is Buddhism is still on the fringes. It hasn't penetrated the mainstream. So as a result, you don't have big institutional support like monasteries and seminaries and institutions that should support the Buddhist faith. Then two, we don't also have a vast number of literature for people to pick and choose and get the best out of it. Three, there's also the shortage of human resources. There are not as many teachers as the Western world really needs. So what they basically end up is having the few. Whether they like it or not, they have to make do with it. And sometimes you find people who don't necessarily live up to their standards or ideals that they preach. So I think we've seen few such cases. But what also is happening, as it has happened in the past in other cases, is when you go through such transmission of ideas and thought systems, you also have, because of the shallow understanding of the situation in the host society, you have a lot of people who will get a slight misconceived, let's say, a mistaken notion of the actual teaching. So to give you a specific example in the case of Buddhism in the West, a lot of the Buddhists in the West think that you must find your root guru, your mullah guru, and then you should stick to him or her and not even go to listen to other teachers unless that root guru sanctions you to do that. That kind of obsession is quite new to the West. In, say, my world, my village, my parents go to all the important lamas. They don't care about which tradition they come from or what kind of teachings they give. I myself, I've studied under about 50 different Tibetan Buddhist masters, have studied in all the known Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and also been a monk for a short period in a Theravada center, have been a Zen practitioner and a Zen master. Traditionally, we are much more open in terms of our spiritual outlook. But in the West, somehow they got this notion that you have to stick to one guru, and if the other guru doesn't like your guru, that guru should be shunned. So that kind of attitude, a very sort of parochial attitude, has led to one, dislike and sort of avoidance of other teachers and traditions, restraining yourself from greater growth. Two, it has led you to idolize the teacher so much. You think your guru is the guru, and you have to obey whatever your guru says, irrespective of whether it is moral or immoral. And I think a lot of the new gurus going from Tibet or even India to the West got that very artificial, idol sort of place, a podium for them to live. And they basically got their ego boosted to the extent that they felt they don't have to any longer follow the moral rules that they impose on others. And then when you have things like the Me Too movement come about, the whole world crumbles. And I think we have seen quite a number of Buddhist teachers who has lost their positions of celebrity in the past few years. I think in the 20th century there were also some Indian gurus who also had their share of scandals and downfall. So this is something that happens as part of a transition.
Thank you very much for your very insightful answers. I think I will now open up the floor to questions from the audience.
Yes,
yes.
Hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Karma. Just wanted to know, we are aware of Buddhism having originated from India. What reason do you attribute for Buddhism practically almost nil in India now? And but for the Tibetan, monasteries and things like that, but there's hardly any real Indian monastery in India. What is the reason why, when Buddhism has flourished in the neighboring countries, it has totally disappeared in India?
To be honest, I don't really have an answer. I haven't studied that part of Buddhist history. Of course, there were many factors like the Arabic invasions that, in some cases, like Nalanda, the whole institution has been burned down because some of the military leaders are not necessarily, they don't necessarily sympathize with non-violence and teachers of non-violence. So there were certainly such political issues that affected Buddhism. The other reason may be also the approach that Buddhism itself takes. Buddhism does quite well in bringing new ideas, very revolutionary, reactionary thinking to a society that's very developed, advanced, and almost stagnated in some cases. But it doesn't necessarily build a social and political system, because that's not the goal of the Buddha. It doesn't really build the social and political infrastructures needed to continue the faith. The focus is so much on the internal transformation that a lot of the Buddhist masters don't care about whether there is enough political support for it or whether there is enough economic support for it. So maybe those also contributed, whereas maybe in the Brahmanical traditions, there is this very firm social structure as well through which the Brahmanical traditions are passed down. These are just my, you could say, speculations. I haven't properly studied this chapter, so I'm pretty sure there are many other authors who have authority in this.
Do you feel that the Brahmanical system or its onslaught was too much for the Buddhist mindful thinking to survive?
I don't know, to be honest. I've studied a little bit of the Brahmanical schools, so the whole range, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, or Sankhya, but again, I haven't done enough to comment on.
Now, my point was, while Buddhism is accepting the foreign thought of the others, whether it is Brahmanical, whether it is any other culture and things like that, the good in everything, they accept and imbibe from it. But is it your feeling that the Islamic or the Brahmanical ones are totally self-centered, for that matter, even Christianity?
Self-centered. On an ontological level, I don't know if the young people here know what ontology is. Ontology being the theory of reality or existence. On an ontological level, I would certainly agree with you, because I've done my work on Buddhist ontology, particularly Shunyata philosophy. The Buddhists deny the notion of the self, whereas in the Brahmanical traditions, as long as the Jain traditions, you have the concept of the Atman. So there is a fundamental difference, philosophically speaking, in terms of the focus on the self. The Buddhists are total self-deniers. And even in the modern context, when you look at Western philosophies, philosophers like Descartes have the concept of self as the sort of, cornerstone of their whole system. I think, therefore I am, this slogan that we attribute to him. Whereas in the Buddhist sense, there is no you who thinks. You are just a cluster of your psychosomatic constituents. My body and my mind and my emotions, my social, cultural, economic factors make this person, you put the label karma to. But there is no real karma. So in the philosophical sense, yes, I would say the other Indian religious traditions and also modern systems are much more self-centered compared to the Buddhist system.
Is there any difference between Buddhism practiced by Tibet and in Bhutan?
Thank you, ma'am. So what Tibet has is a very rich, wide range of religious schools, Buddhist schools. Bhutan has only two of the four main Tibetan Buddhist schools. Now, if I may give you again a little bit, if you would allow me, Kenji. Buddhism went through three phases here in India. In the first phase, since the Buddha's time until about the beginning of the Christian era, you had the mainstream Buddhist schools composed of so many different monastic groups that we call Nikayas. And out of some 18 or more Nikayas that existed around Ashoka's time, today we have the Theravada group, the Theravadins in Burma, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, and some parts of Asian countries. And you have the Sarvastivada, the Mullah Sarvastivada particularly, in Tibet and Bhutan and the Himalayas, and the Dharmaguptaka group being passed through China, Japan, and Korea. And then in the beginning of the Christian era, there were lots of these monks who came up with new ideas, and the whole movement of the Mahayana began. So Mahayana was not necessarily a sect independent of the existing schools, but rather revolutionary or progressive monk thinkers who expanded the idea of the Buddha into a much bigger system. And we find this tradition developing in India around the Christian era and really becoming well established by the time of Shantideva, Chandrakirti and so forth in the middle of the first millennium. And China gets its Buddhism around that time, or before, around the time Mahayana is being established here, and that's why you have Mahayana Buddhism in places like China, Japan, and Korea. And then in the middle of the first millennium, you see also a very important change happening to Buddhism in India. There was a syncretic process where the Buddhists and the non-Buddhists in India, particularly the Brahmanical traditions, start to sort of exchange ideas and merge things. So we have a whole new system of the Tantric Buddhism developing from the middle of the first millennium. And that has already developed in India by the time Buddhism came to Tibet and Bhutan. So that's why we have today all these three phases. The early mainstream Buddhist phase of monks and very conservative practice of non-violence and non-harming. Then the Mahayana practice of altruism and compassion and so forth, and the very advanced tantric Vajrayana practice. So if you look at the person of the Dalai Lama, for instance, the Dalai Lama is a monk, foremost a monk from the Mula Sarvastivadin tradition, who is practicing non-harming and non-self from the early Buddhist system. But he's also a Mahayana practitioner. He practices compassion and bodhicitta, and meditation, shunyata and so forth. But he's also a tantrika, a Vajrayana teacher who does these abhishekas, big grand empowerments like Kalachakra empowerment. So you see in a master like the Dalai Lama all these three phases being integrated. And so in Tibet, often the Tibetan Buddhists claim that they have the entire spectrum of Buddhism. And of the wide range of Buddhist traditions in Tibet, Bhutan has two, the Nyingma and the Kagyu schools. The Kagyu school is still the state religion of Bhutan.
One more question is, what's the difference between Vipassana and mindfulness?
Thank you, ma'am. So, mindfulness is a modern English terminology being used to translate some part of Vipassana, I would say. Vipassana, which in the Himalayas is translated as Laktong, is the insight meditation. So you have two actually forms of meditation being taught in the classical Indian Buddhist literature. One shamatha, the other vipassana. Shamatha is more about calming the mind. So imagine your mind is like a muddy water. You take a bottle of water with mud, shake it up. That muddy water is supposed to be the ordinary state of the mind. Shamatha is really to calm that down and help the process of sedimentation, to help get clarity in the ordinary mind by doing meditation, mainly to a single point in meditation to sort of get better concentration. So shamatha is not even considered as technically a Buddhist meditation. It's something that anyone can take up. You can focus on your body and develop that concentration. You can focus on your breath and develop that concentration. You can focus on a flower or a Buddha statue and develop that concentration. It doesn't really come with a religious content. It's just a mental exercise to focus. And you reach, of course, higher levels of cognitive power when you are fully developed. Once you have the concentration, the Indian Buddhist masters argue that to break through the cycle of rebirth, the samsara, you need to take up vipassana. And their concept of vipassana is of using that concentration on a topic that will bring sort of salvation or liberation from this existence. So on thinking, on focusing on topics like impermanence, to realize the nature of change and impermanence, that will be vipassana practice. To meditate on the idea of non-self, that there is no true self to which we should cling to, that is vipassana. So vipassana comes with serious philosophical or existential content. So those are the two different meditation techniques you find in the classical literature. Now, Mr. Genka-ji of Burma has been so good in promoting vipassana, but combining it with shamatha in that from little I know of his vipassana tradition is mostly shamatha, but then bringing in elements of vipassana like watching the moments of one's breath or the changes in one's body, being acutely aware of the impermanence, the emptiness, the fleeting nature of ourselves. In what is going around today as mindfulness is also that, but they focus less on the more abstruse, advanced topics. It's more about watching the breath. That's a very common one, just watching one's breath, simply following one's breath. Or the other one is doing what they call a body scan. So you just feel the body from the crown all the way to the heel. Just be in the moment, feeling the body. Sometimes part of the body, other times the entire body. So it's a much more simplified, watered down version of vipassana. But the analogy I've given you again, shamatha is really like sedimentation, where the dirt is not removed, it has just settled. Vipassana is distillation, where you're really trying to get rid of the dirt and purify your mind or your consciousness totally.
Any other questions? Yes?
What's the basic difference between Mahayana and Hinayana?
So the difference between Mahayana and the pre-Mahayana form of Buddhism, I as an academic, I am a bit careful about using the term Hinayana, because Hinayana is a term that the Mahayana scholars and practitioners use in a slightly derogatory manner to refer to those who preceded him. So what the Buddha really taught, if you really get the gist of the Buddha's teachings, there are two. There is one, the philosophical outlook on oneself and the world. And the crux of his philosophical outlook was that we are interdependent. We are made up of so many causes and conditions and paths. There's no real karma in me. I'm just made up of so many different factors. My body, my mind, my thoughts, emotions, social status, cultural upbringing, and so forth. So karma is just a fiction, a label you give to this cluster of so many parts. And that basically underscores his theory of non-self. There's no real true existence of anything. Things are just put together, many parts and factors being put together. And then he said that morally speaking, you have to avoid causing harm. There's no room in Buddhism for conscious, active acts of harm. So taking life is the first precept a Buddhist has to follow, to claim to be a follower of Buddha. So you cannot take life at all. So what you have is two, non-harming as a moral practice and non-self as a philosophical belief or understanding. What the Mahayana masters practically did was sort of elaborated these two. Non-harming was elaborated and expanded into a full practice of compassion, with a theory that not only should you avoid harm, you should actually help others if you can. And for a bodhisattva, it becomes a requirement that you help. So the active practice of compassion and altruism comes into the picture with the full development of Mahayana thought. Then in the same way, this idea of non-self is expanded to the concept of emptiness or shunyata. Just as there is no karma, there is no table either. Table is just an empirical experience we have, but there is no real intrinsic self-existent table. It's just many parts put together in a certain shape. And so the Mahayana philosophers go on to argue that there's nothing with self-existence or true existence. Everything is like a dream or an illusion, which is what also Shankaracharya or some of the Adya Vedanta scholars later on populated. So this idea of the world being like a magical illusion. Then it's not only table or karma that doesn't exist. They went on to argue that to even see the absence of the table, that itself is a conceptual construct. You cannot find the non-tableness, so to say. So there's no existence, sati, or then there's no non-existence, and there's no both and neither. You need to transcend all the thought constructs, all the mental fixations. So that's what Mahayana brings as a philosophy, a way to look at reality without any fixation, without any mental constructs. And what you also see with the rise of Mahayana is the pantheon of Buddhist figures increase. Before Mahayana, you have few Buddhas, but when Mahayana came into existence, there were many new Buddhas not only of this world, but of the other world systems and universes. You have many Bodhisattva figures, so you see the entire pantheon of Buddhist deities also increased Mahayana. Anyway, Mahayana basically expanded the existing tradition, and that's why it became known as the greater vehicle of Mahayana.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to ask the final question. So, Karmala, I mean, you have studied Buddhism as religion and a way of life in Bhutan and in India, and you have also studied Buddhism as an academic discipline, as a social science, with with rigor in the West. So, and the other thing is you have been a Buddhist, right? Both in the East and the West, and now you sort of straddle these divides and these worlds. I would ask, so at this point, what is your Buddhism?
A very good question, isn't it? So, I often say that we really need to reappropriate and reformulate our past heritage to make it relevant for our times and the future. Talking about today's theme, we see the transition of Buddhism or transmission of Buddhism from the East to the West. In the East, the system has developed to the extent that it has also got stagnated. Now, when the system of ideas develops and remains for a long time, then it accrues all the social, political trappings with it. So you have many Buddhist practices and routines and rituals that then become to the fore and hide the original message, the original purpose of those teachings. And that is one problem we have, I think, in the native Buddhist countries like Tibet and Bhutan. People have now sometimes lost the knowledge of the original purpose of the Buddha's teachings and got sort of distracted by the rituals and the routines and all the colorful things that happen. This is probably also true to some extent with the practice of Hinduism in India. Whereas in the West, because it's a new system, they can be selective, they can be choosy. They take what is most useful, and they can also find the original instrumental part of the Buddhist message, that they, like mindfulness, you know there is a direct benefit and therefore you adopt it. You don't really take it up as a cultural practice, as a ritual. So what we need to do also, I think, in native Buddhist countries and also in some other parts of the world where Buddhism is often confused with the cultural practices that come with it, we need to unpack the Buddha's teachings properly. We need to take the core values, the timeless principles, and apply them to the contemporary situation to really help us meet our needs. Let me illustrate that with an example. Do you have time?
Yes.
How many of you here know what the Buddha's first sermon was on? I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. I'm asking the young people particularly. The Buddha gave his first sermon in Varanasi, in Sarnath, in Uttar Pradesh. And his first sermon was delivered to his 5 colleagues. And the topic was 4 noble truths. He basically declared that life is full of suffering. There is a cause to the suffering, but then fortunately there's also a cessation of the suffering, and there's a path to the cessation. You ask a monk to deliver this. The monk will deliver this as a very holy sermon, talking about this very important existential issue of life and life's problems. But what I actually prefer to, how I prefer to look at this is the Buddha as, in his days, a new thinker, a new sort of social scientist. And what he delivered at the first sermon is really a management theory, a management strategy. He was basically saying life is full of problems. Truth number 1. And these problems don't come out of nowhere. They have causes and conditions, truth number 2. And then there is a solution to these problems, truth 3. And there is a strategic way to reach that solution, truth 4. It's actually problem-solving strategy, if you put it in a modern management jargon. And so he was quite pragmatic in that respect, that you have to look at the life in this manner, and then sort of act on how you solve the problems and seek the solution. And he gives the right Eightfold Path. And if you look at the right Eightfold Path, I can't go into detail now, I wish I had time, but it's actually a very systematic way on starting a project to end your problems. Whether you are a business person or an academic or an artist or a writer, the right Eightfold Path actually can be very neatly integrated in your approach, in your way to sort of take up a project to seek a solution to the problems in life. And what we don't now see is we don't see the Four Noble Truths and the Right Eightfold Path as an easily applicable humanistic value. We sort of shelve it up in the scriptures as a wholly religious topic. And there is that discontinuity or disjunction which we need to address. Make his teachings, bring the raw value of the teachings into the daily lives. And in that respect, again, one problem we have in traditional Buddhist communities, we outsource our spirituality to the religious persons. I'm sure Indians also do that. You hire the sadhus to do the rituals. Now, 11 months of your year, you're doing business or work that is sometimes even unethical. That's not acceptable morally. And then 1 month you may go on a long pilgrimage to sort of get over that guilt and expiate your negative papa, the papas you have accumulated. So what we really need to do is personalize, bring spirituality into our own daily lives, make it part and parcel of whatever we are doing in our normal lives. And I think this is a very important task for both the native traditional Buddhists as well as the new Buddhists around the world, that you adopt these timeless core principles that the Buddha has left, irrespective of what faith you belong to, and then make that part and parcel of your daily life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brahmaputra, for sharing your experience and your expertise with us. This has been very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me conclude with a saying of Buddha. Do not believe in anything that I say just out of respect for me, but taste it for yourself. Analyze it as if you were buying gold. Modern day people like such a non-dogmatic approach. Well, thank you so much for this enlightening session. Karma Punsho and Tenzin Deki, we honor. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, attendees.